This is part two of the discussion of independence movements in Africa, focusing on Ghana. Um, we mentioned Kwame Nkrumah, who had spent some time in the United States and also in Europe, and he returned to Africa in 1947. In the following year, there were consumer protests in the British colony, what was then the British colony of the Gold Coast, and these were occurring in the primary city there in Accra. And basically what had happened is that the wages had not gone up with the rising prices in the post-war era. And so there were some protests, and some of the protesters took a list of grievances. They marched to the governor's, essentially the governor of the colony there, marched to his castle, and basically many of them were shot. And so there was some rioting and looting that had gone on as a result of this. And historian David Birmingham says that the African Revolution had begun, that this is sort of the moment, kind of a turning point in 1948. So you have these sort of buildup of nationalism and Pan-Africanism. You have the sort of rhetorical advantage of using the results of World War II and ideas of democracy that kind of flow from that, and the victory of the Allies, and also, of course, that many of the people in the colonies in Africa had fought on the side of the Allies, and that they felt like they had sort of earned their independence as a result of that. But David Birmingham suggested this 1948 moment is somewhat of a turning point. So this had happened in Accra, and Kwame Nkrumah was in a different city at this time, but the British authorities actually arrested him and some of the other leaders. And at this point, it was not a really, really aggressive sort of independence movement, but they had sort of developed some of those ideas. But by 1950, after Kwame Nkrumah had been released from prison, which really sort of elevated his stature, by the way. But after he had been released from prison, in 1950, he calls for a positive action campaign. And this is when the real more aggressive, nonviolent tactics are being used. So a lot of these are sort of Gandhian ideals, that, Gandhi was sort of one of his heroes, as he had been to, sort of many people in that era. And so, as in India, you had civil disobedience, there were strikes, and of course you have to remember that the main part of why the British are there, or why European countries are involved in Africa, is to exploit labor as a money-making scheme. So even though it's not necessarily slavery, and they may be being paid a small amount, when people strike, this is really going to hit them where it counts in terms of the pocketbook. So strikes, and there's massive protests throughout the country. And the British authorities start to realize that things are changing, and maybe Kwame Nkrumah and these type of leaders will actually help us to sort of make a transition of power to the Africans. But they always, a lot of them wanted this to be a very gradual process, and not only just a gradual process, but ensuring that they sort of had leaders in power that would allow them, even if the British weren't technically colonizing, to allow their sort of industry to continue to thrive and still have economic opportunities. So actually in 1951, Kwame Nkrumah is incorporated into the leadership. He's termed a leader of the government business, is sort of his title. And by 1952, he is appointed as the prime minister. And all of this is actually still under British colonial rule. It's not until 1957 that the real independence for Ghana comes. And, aside from the asterisks, I guess, as you could say, the Ethiopia and Liberia, really this is the first country in Africa to get their independence. And South Africa is a little bit of a unique case, which we'll talk about that at another time. So they're sort of the lead, taking the lead in independence, and now many other countries in this region are pushing for their independence as well. And in the following years, 1960 is being as one of the major years where a lot of countries, places in Africa, especially under British and French rule, get their independence. But you know, the battle still wages on, literally in the case in some places in terms of battle in Algeria. So you see Kwame Nkrumah in 1960 give a speech to the United Nations, you know, basically pushing for Algerian independence. He's saying things like, you know, that France can no longer maintain this fiction that Algeria is part of France, when in fact that, you know, Algeria is African and always will be so. And so this is an indicator of Kwame Nkrumah, certainly a very important figure in Ghanaian independence, but also really in the independence of many different areas in Africa. That by the 1960s, many countries were. The southern African countries, generally like Mozambique, came a little bit later, like in the 1970s, and you even have countries like in Southwest Africa, the German colony, which in Southwest Africa, Namibia, did not become fully independent until 1990. That had previously been a colony of Germany. So we'll stop it there, and we'll talk soon.